Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar on program-related investing. Is now the time. A very apropos topic, as I'm sure is the reason why you're all on this webinar today. Bonjour et bienvenue à ce webinaire sur les investissements liés au programme. My name is Lisa Goulet. I'm Director of Member Relations and Research at Philanthropic Foundations Canada. A few technical things before we get started to ensure that the sound quality and no one has any technical issues as we go through this webinar. First of all, we have over 40 participants today, so please remain mute for the entire presentation to ensure sound quality. Second, we'll be having a question and answer period about midway through the presentation and again at the end. And because there are quite a few participants today, we ask that you submit your questions in the chat box, which we will moderate, and hopefully we'll get to all of the questions. So that's it for the technical part. And I'd like to welcome our two presenters today. We're fortunate to have with us two charity lawyers well-versed in legal issues relating to charities. Many of you already know Susan Manwaring, who is with Miller Thomson's Toronto office and who has been working with PFC for many years. And we also have with us her colleague Troy McEachren from the Miller Thomson Montreal office. And Troy se fera un plaisir de répondre à vos questions en français, donc n'hésitez pas de poser vos questions en français. And you can also view their full bios on their website. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Susan, who will get us started. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. So we are, and maybe you can advance the slide for us. Thanks. To the next slide too. Thanks. So what we're looking to, no, back one, please. What we're hoping to talk about today, or what we're going to talk about today, not hoping to talk about today, is social investing, but very particularly mission or program related investing, although we're going to give some general overview about investing in general. And I think in talking to the office at PFC and Jean-Marc and others, we thought that this topic would be good because in the midst of these COVID-19 times, what we're seeing as counsel for many organizations like yourselves is that people are very interested in how can we support organizations? How can we help organizations? And sometimes I'm hearing from people, they want to do it other than by granting, because there is a great need and the granting may be beyond the sort of the annual expenditures of the foundation, or maybe in ways that are different. So that the question of how can we invest or how can we help with additional funds has come up. And I think last week, for those of you who were in attendance, Troy and I talked about how you granted or how you worked with non-charities in the concept of trying to fund nonprofits and other organizations who are working in this area. And today we're really focusing on the extension of that, which is how to do investing. So the kinds of concepts we're going to talk about are mission investing, impact investing, socially responsible investing, and then the focus on program-related investment. All of these terms are important in this area. Often when we're talking about mission investing or socially responsible investing, we're more in this is a prudent investment versus a risky investment spectrum, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the bottom line is these are things that where the primary goal is not just about financial returns, but we're trying to think of ways to creatively use the funds, align with your charitable purposes, and enable other organizations to do more to help, whether it's in the current need or, of course, this will extend beyond the current times as we move forward and start working in other areas. So that's really the focus of what we'll be talking about today. Troy?
Merci Susan. Donc, comme Lisa a dit, moi je suis à Montréal. Donc, on ne donne pas la présentation bilingue, de une façon bilingue. On a fait le diapo en français puis en anglais. On a ajouté les deux ensemble. Mais comme Susan a dit, le but de cette présentation aujourd'hui est de parler et d'en discuter une autre façon que les fondations des organismes de bienfaisance peut supporter la mission des entités. Une certaine limitation, comme Susan a indiqué, avec les grantings ou avec les donations, les transferts des fonds ou même de travailler avec des OBNL parmi des ententes, des contrats de mandat. On va examiner plus en détail le concept de social investing ou des placements sociaux qui a effectivement deux volets, mais on parle plus d'un outil de financement avec d'autres bénéfices, d'autres flexibilités ou possibilités, mais nous sommes dans le contexte des investissements, qui est un autre moyen que les organismes peuvent aider les organismes qui sont vraiment en besoin présentement et aujourd'hui. So I think we can go to the next slide.
So really what we're both going to focus on is what will either fit as a mission investment, so that you may be interested, or your organization may be interested in loans or some kind of investment that would fall into what we would commonly call mission investment. And we see lots of that. There's a great trend now for foundations to invest some of their portfolio in investments that are definitely socially purposed aligned, but they also have aspects of the structure to those investments that meet a prudent investor test. And then the program-related investments is a concept and a term we use today, which has history in the United States. It's a concept that was introduced in the US regulatory system some years ago, particularly for foundations and other organizations that wanted to make investments in organizations that weren't otherwise 501c3 or tax exempt or registered charity type organizations. And there's quite a system in these states around how they regulate the program related investments. In Canada, we liked the concept, but we don't have the system. We don't have a regulatory regime that matches, but we've taken it on and we've morphed it to our rules. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And these are really where the social purpose probably takes precedent over the investment returns. And the key is that we need to look slightly differently at the characteristics of these investments when deciding whether to bring them into your portfolio. And but so we'll give you the background around, is it a prudent investor, and then we'll talk about the PRIs. So on to the next slide and back to Troy.
Perfect. So the thing to keep in mind is that this concept of prudent investor standard is applicable pan-Canadian. It applies across the country. All of the common law provinces either have trustee legislation or legislation that affect charities that will expressly indicate that a charity has to meet certain rules for their investments, or by implication in court judgments. The main one we're going to talk about is the Trustee Act of Ontario, which has a specific set of rules that are applicable to trustees and are also applicable to charities. In Quebec, very quickly, just so we can lay the groundwork, I think that the rules of full administration apply to a charity in Quebec. I won't bore you with all the gory details, but I think that there's a reason that analysis that say yes, it's the rules of full administration, which is great because in Quebec we have adopted the prudent investor standard. So what I'm saying here is applicable across the country, and I'll indicate a couple in places where Quebec might be slightly different, but the rules are fundamentally the same. So it requires the care, skill, and diligence and judgment of a prudent investor would exercise in making investments. What the heck does that mean? That basically means that you've got to look at what a reasonable person in that circumstance investing for a charity, with the restrictions that are imposed by the donors or by the Income Tax Act, that they would apply. So it's kind of an objective standard that a prudent investor in a similar situation would apply. There are also an additional benefit that will be taken into consideration, is that the special relationship or special values or the purpose of the trust. And that's very helpful because charities have purposes and values that are the same thing as other types of trust. So the point we're going to look at now is the spectrum. So you've got, as Susan said, the mission investing, which is much more of a financial return tool, all the way to the program related investment where there may be higher risk and much lower return, but it's still within that kind of investment framework. So if you could move to the next slide. So what are the prudent investor considerations? And these are the sort of the 7 things that you have to keep in mind. One is the general economic conditions, which are shockingly terrible now, there is no doubt, but this is sort of an extreme situation that we're in. Inflation or deflation, that can have effect on the value of a portfolio or the value of assets. Tax considerations is more relevant when you don't pay tax, but in this instance, charities don't. So we don't, that role is not as important because we don't worry about selling an investment because it will trigger a tax, which is very helpful. The role of each investment, the overall portfolio, the thing to keep in mind with prudent investor theory is that there is no investment that is off the table. So you can have extremely high risk investment. The question is, how does it fit within the overall strategy? So that's very helpful for charities when they'll say, can we do a risky type of investment? And the answer is, well, what's the percentage? What's the role? What type of investment it is? Nothing's off the table, so there's some flexibility there. You've also got to look at the return of income and also capital growth. You got to have that balance between the two. So you can, yes, have your income for today, but you want to make sure that you understand the impact on your capital going forward to deal with things like inflation. Need for liquidity, income, preservation of capital. We've got a situation now where income may not be coming in as nicely as what it was in the past. So we've got to plan for some of that. So you've got to look at the short term and the long term. And what is really interesting is for the charity is the concept that the special relationship or special value to the purposes of the charities or its beneficiaries. And remember that this not only means what the wishes of the donors are, but also what's the mission, what's your purpose, what are you trying to achieve, and what are the goals. And that can really help when you're looking at some of these mission investments or program related investments to say, you know, this really fits with our core values, and it gives you a great deal of flexibility when you're looking at things to invest in or not to invest in. So we'll just go to the next slide. So a couple things to keep in mind when we're looking at this prudent investor theory is that there is an obligation to diversify, and that sounds great. And what does it mean? Well, it means that you've got to be diversified, not in 10 different financial institutions or 10 different investment advisors. What diversification means is that you're going to diversify your portfolio into a series of different types of investments, perhaps with different regional impact and different industries. So diversification really means within the portfolio and even the type of investment, bonds versus cash versus equity. So that's what diversification means. So it doesn't mean that you need 5 or 6 pots all over the place. It just means within the pot, the concept diversification. You can go out, you can get investment advice. In fact, I think it's a part of the prudent investor rule when you've got larger investments at stake and you've got a, not necessarily the most, not everybody's going to be an investment advisor, but to go out and get professional advice. That is something that is important. And also to have oftentimes either a finance committee or an investment committee. They're really going to be members of the community that have a certain level of expertise, which we can bring to the table, but going out and seeking that advice from quality investment advisors is key. In the Trustee Act in Ontario and all the other jurisdictions, there's much greater flexibility to authorize agents to act on your behalf, which could mean giving some more discretionary powers to the agent to make investment decisions, obviously within the confines of a prudent, sensible plan, but there is some flexibility there that you know, you don't have to be sitting at your computer looking at trades. You can really get out there and have some quality investment advisors. So we'll just move to the next slide. Quebec, again, exact same rules, exact same standards, exact same concepts. There's a little bit more of a restriction in working with an agent. We're not able to delegate as freely, but the main point to take away from here is that no one should delegate freely to a third party to do our investment. So I think we're in the same level of control and supervision. And this time of the year, very quickly, or this time, what we're going through is there's lots and lots and lots and lots of change and fluctuation, and it's very difficult to know, how the markets are going to go. I'm not an investment advisor. I'm not going to give any investment advice, but I don't think that we need to be in a panic mode and to go to necessarily say, oh, our portfolio is being hit so incredibly aggressively, should we take some extreme actions? I would say, this is the time to seek out advice, professional advice, and to have a bit more comfort and understand from the investment advisor or advisors to give some advice. And I think that would meet that prudent investor standard, especially in this time of uncertainty. So I think we can go to the next. Yeah, so questions. So if anybody at this point had any questions about just the basics of I know we went very quickly and there's lots to unpack in there about the framework. So if you had any questions, feel free to raise them now. If not,
there is a question. It says, are there legal requirements of who the manager is operating as the prudent investor, e.g. CFA designation, other qualifications, experience?
I have a lot of trust experience, so I'll bring a lot of that because I deal with this a lot in the trust realm. No, it's you obviously want the person who, there's no specific requirement other than somebody who is licensed. So it can be one of the large financial institutions or somebody who has the specific licensing. You can check with the local provincial licensing bodies to make sure. There's no specific rule, but like anything, before you hire somebody, you want to do some due diligence. You want to get an understanding of who they are, what their policies are, what their track record is. Are they registered? Those kinds of things. So, that kind of due diligence. And sometimes with larger portfolios, there could be one or two, or maybe even three investment advisors who may be involved. But also this is where your investment advising team of directors are going to come in to help. They'll have some experience and some expertise that they can bring to the table to help make that decision about the investment advisor per se. But there's no specific rule that you must have this person or not this type of person with a qualification.
Any other questions? There is a question about this is being recorded. It's being recorded, right?
It is being recorded, and I just wanted to mention that at the end of the session, the recording will be made available, as will the PowerPoint slides in the language of their choice. We also have them in English and in French, so that will all be available afterwards. So we don't have any additional questions right now, Susan, and I also see that you see them all as well. So when one is speaking, the other can moderate. That's terrific. So if, I may jump in at some point if I see there's any questions. So over to you.
Okay, great. So on to the next slide. So what, as we talked about at the beginning, we've got this concept of, we're really talking about a spectrum of social purpose investing. So, and when we talk about it, whenever we look as a foundation at investing or looking into making other than grants in other organizations, we come up with a question of how does it work within the Income Tax Act? What kind of investment is it? What are the rules we have to think about? So this next slide really is simply sort of a placeholder in the sense, not placeholder, but it's a comment on the issues that we would likely bring to the table. If you came to us, you have a prospective investment, let's say it's in a nonprofit in your community that wants to do some work providing perhaps temporary housing to families of people who have a member of the family who's ill, and you're trying to do some kind of temporary lending or something. What we would consider as counsel for the organization is the nature of how you're going to do this support. We want to think about rules. of the Income Tax Act around related business. So we're thinking to ourselves, it can't be a grant because you're working with a non-charity. So is it an activity that you're going to carry on as a foundation yourself, and is it somehow a business activity? And it's important here because public foundations can carry on sort of what we would call a business activity that is related to their purpose, but private foundations can't. So we're just going to ask that question when you describe your investment for us. Then if we're thinking about these kinds of investments and they involve some kind of investing in a corporation or some kind of share investment where you might decide to invest in a company that is doing something that is tied to a social purpose, we have to talk about the excess business holdings rules, which you probably know about in the sense that there are limits on the percentage of shares that your organization as a private foundation can hold. Finally are the types of tax issues that we often talk about when dealing with working with non-charities, which we talked about in the webinar last week, which I think you can also find on the PFC website. Around is it your own activities and do you have direction and control? So all of these concepts would likely be brought into the discussion if you came and asked us, here's something we want to do, how does it fit and how do we make it work? And Lisa, if we go to the next slide, and of course then, and one of the things, if it is an investment like Troy has been talking about, we will then look at it and sort of think about where does it fit on the spectrum of investments? Is it a mission investment, which is sort of, from my perspective, those kinds of investments which are clearly prudent investments, as Troy was just talking about, so would fit in the traditional concept of prudence. There may be risk, there may be social purpose, but there's also a fairly significant expectation of financial return, and they look a lot like your traditional investments in your endowment portfolio. And that's at one end of the spectrum. And then as you move closer to the other end of the spectrum, which is where you make grants, which is clearly not an investment, but you're just basically giving your money away, knowing they're going to use it for a particular purpose. Along the spectrum, we get into program-related investments. And when we look at what we call a program-related investment, we're thinking that it is riskier and more mission-directed than investment-directed, in the sense of we're not necessarily thinking you're going to get a financial return. Or if we get a financial return, it may be at less than market value, or it may not be guaranteed. It may be that you'll get your money back in 10 years, but there's actually not any sort of significant appreciation or return on it, so that it has an obligation to return it in some fashion, but it's not like it's creating investments for you. So, and when we get into that structure, we're thinking that these are more like program related investments. And the reason this is important is because it allows us to accept them for purposes of your charity and say these are investments that are used in our charitable activity, and they're not meant to be prudent investments that are in our endowment portfolio. Because from a trust law perspective, as Troy talked about, if they're the assets you don't use directly in your charitable activity, there is this obligation that they have to be invested prudently. Whereas if we can pull them into assets that we're using for charitable purposes, we can still be investing them, but we don't have to be as concerned about that prudent investor test. So again, they're not grants, but they're probably closer to grants than prudent investments. And as we go forward, I'm going to talk about some examples, and I'm going to talk about some of the rules that we have to look at for program-related investments. But to start, I'm going to make a statement that is very important for us all to remember, is that if you're thinking about a program-related investment in another registered charity or a qualified donee, which, as you will know, has is a broader category of organization, but it's most other registered charities and then some other listed entities to which a registered charity can make a grant. So qualified donees can receive grants. And if you decide, however, you want to do your program related investment in a qualified donee, then that's almost easier because it's a qualified donee, the fact that you're not making a return and the fact that you may not get your money back or it's riskier doesn't create problems for your organization. You can still say, I'm allowed to do that because that organization is a charity. So if I end up losing my money to that organization, it's not going to be an issue from the Canada Revenue Agency perspective. Whereas if I make the PRI in a non-qualified donee, we're always at risk that we're going to be challenged by the Canada Revenue Agency that we've made a grant to a non-qualified donee. So when we start making program related investments in something that's not a charity, we have to fall back again to the rules around direction and control. And when I get to the examples, I think that it will help illustrate this. But basically what I'm saying is we can still treat these as being used in charitable work, because the purpose of the investment when it's going to a non-qualified donee is still to further a charitable purpose. It could be, housing people in need. It could be poverty relief. It could be community economic development. But actually, can you go back, please? Sorry, I haven't jumped to the next slide yet. But it is still so it's still being used in a charitable activity, but we need to have oversight over what that organization is doing to a certain extent because that organization is not a charity. The second thing we have to think about is that if that investment is in an organization that's not a charity, that there isn't what we call excess private benefit, which is that someone other than the charitable purpose it's supposed to be furthering is somehow benefiting from the investment your charity is making, rather than having that investment go to furthering the charitable purpose. Next slide, please. So as I've said, that the PRI is really intended to create an investment to further your charitable purpose. And this is where, and the fact that it's going to your charitable activity and it's considered on the charitable side is, again, probably because it's not likely going to meet that prudent investment standard. And so this is really the tool you want to use to access your funds, access your endowment, access your ability to use your funds to support organization for social returns rather than investment returns, and still be on side both the trustee law and the tax law and the rules around how you can grant and what you have to grant to. So next slide, please. So in this case, what we're going to see is that in the context of doing these PRIs, what we're going to want to see is that there is appropriate agreements in place. So it's not a grant agreement. Again, we're in a different perspective, and it's not if you're in the context of a prudent investment and you have let's say a qualifying limited partnership investment that foundations can now do, then there will be certain agreements there around that kind of investment. In the PRI space, we do want investments. Even if it's in a registered charity, it's smart to have some kind of investment or some kind of agreement, to ensure that it's clear that it is an investment, not a grant. When we're working with non-qualified donees, we want to make sure that the agreements contain rules around monitoring, reporting. It's actually interesting because when you look at the Canada Revenue Agency rules around PRIs, they talk about having an element of direction and control through monitoring and reporting. So it's actually, they don't actually require this for those of you who have who are familiar with the direction and control concept, where they say the chair, you know, you really have to have direction and control on the decision making. The comments on PRI seem to recognize that it's likely that as an investment that you're really not going to be directing and controlling everything that's going on, but that they want you to have the monitoring and reporting. And the policy behind this is really that you're taking your charitable dollars, you want to further a charitable purpose, and they want you, and if it's, especially if it's in a non-charity, they want your foundation to be able to demonstrate that it has some way to ensure that that money is going to further that charitable purpose.
Susan, sorry to interrupt, but before you proceed, I actually have a question, which I think
Sure.
is an interesting one, and I'm sure many have the same question. Does this mean you should not include your impact investments in a calculation of your disbursement quota?
Yes. Well, I'm going to give you the lawyer's answer. I see Karen asked this question. It depends. So if you're relying on the PRI concept, and it truly is a PRI in the sense that it's an investment where you're treating it has risk, it's considered to be an asset used to further your charitable purpose, you don't have to include it in the calculation of the value of the assets that are under investment that are not used in charitable activity. So CRA does permit the value of an investment that is a PRI to be taken out of the value of the endowment fund on which the 3.5% is applied. Now, the reason I said it depends is that sometimes mission investments are more likely to be considered an endowment investment than a PRI. But I think in the context of an organization, a foundation that has a program-related investment or impact investing policy, where they have a program around that, where you're looking for investments in organizations that really are either in qualified donees or non-qualified donees with these kinds of agreements, then those values could actually, the value of that investment, the market could be taken out of the endowment value for purposes of calculating the 3.5%. So that would be, that would definitely fall outside of that. So my thing says my internet connection is unstable. If you guys lose me, Troy, you know what to do. So
you're still there. We can still see you and hear you.
Good. Okay. So so again, the monitoring, the other thing that is off that we need in the agreements where we're at this closer to the grant spectrum, it's really a PRI, there's risk, et cetera, is that we need an exit mechanism. So the point of that goes back to my point about policy. CRA wants to know that you as a charity, particularly if you're investing in a non-charity, are able to track the funds and take the money back if they start to do something improper with it, something that isn't furthering the purpose. So if this PRI is in a charity, this is less important, but if it's in a non-charity, this is important, so that you, and the reality is, part of the reasoning behind this, and I always go to reasoning because it helps me understand, is that CRA has the right to audit charities on this stuff. It doesn't necessarily have the right to audit a nonprofit on this or a for-profit on this. So the reason they want you to have the exit mechanism if you're investing in a for-profit or a nonprofit is because they want you to do that auditing. They want you to ensure that it's being used to further the charitable purpose, because they know that they don't have the jurisdiction to walk in and check that. So it really fits into that. So they also, CRA also suggests that if you're doing PRIs and you've identified a portion of funding in your foundation to do this kind of work, that you put together a policy, that you have a framework within which your foundation works, so that you're doing it consistently. You can tick the boxes of the policy every time you make a PRI to say we've focused on things, we've asked these questions, that sort of thing. So that is also something that we would suggest, and they also caution that we have to meet all the rules. Next slide, please, Lise. So I think that a helpful way to understand PRIs is to realize, and these are examples that CRA has provided, and that, you know, we've heard the Director General of the Charities Directorate talk about, actually Kathy Hawara talked about these examples at a PFC conference a number of years ago. But what it demonstrates to you as examples is this is the kind of thing we're talking about. And when you hear me describe this, you'll realize that they don't actually fit into that as well into that prudent investor category that Troy talked about, and that's why we're looking for somewhere else to put them. So the first example is investment in shares of a for-profit corporation. Now, you invest in publicly listed shares of for-profit corporations all the time for your assets that are not used in charitable activity, but those are publicly traded. There's all sorts of, there's a market, there's control. This is really a for-profit entity that is a small corporation. And I know there's one that Troy and I have talked about in Montreal, where they're developing apartments. Some of them will be for students, some of them will be for seniors, some of them will be market, and they're trying to raise money, and they want money from, as you know, especially for those who are with seniors or students or individuals with disability, they want to know they need to raise money and help support the organization, because they have for-profit investors, but they're mostly interested in the market investing. So in this case, the foundation, which may have a purpose of furthering education or have a general charitable purpose or want to work with people in low income, is able to invest in the shares of this entity and actually invest and support the development of units in this complex that will be available to those charitable beneficiaries, and can buy shares of this corporation. And then, but the investment, let's say it's $3 million, is going to be supported by an agreement in this entity whereby the company says we will allocate this number of units, and we will make sure these units are available at these prices, and we will fund or support, or we will work with the city to get rent supplements, etc. But there will be an allocation, there will be some requirements around it, and the company will agree to report back, and the company will not only do these things and report back and you know, achieve that social purpose, they'll probably make everyone know that their part of their complex is being used for these purposes. But it's a way to allow you to invest, and because it's in shares, if the complex value goes up, if there are profits and revenues from other aspects of the company, your or charity may get dividends, or you may receive returns. There will also be some kind of an agreement around how do you sell those shares, or how do you get paid back for those shares. But it's likely that it will be that there's no guarantee on the dividends. It's likely that it will say you can be bought out for the shares when the complex is sold, or when somebody, you know, the majority shareholder sells, you get to be bought as well. So there won't be guarantees, and there won't be a free market for you to sell those. So they're not really, you know, there's a question of, is it prudent? When will we get paid back? What kind of return will we get? But the social purpose can override that. It can be used in your social, you know, as a charitable activity, but you're monitoring, making sure that the charitable beneficiaries are receiving it. And in the event, in that agreement, all of a sudden that organization decides not to provide those units to people who are your charity, who would qualify under your requirements, you could provide that the owner of that company has to buy you out at market plus something, so that would be your exit. The other kind, and that investment in shares in a for-profit is clearly non-qualified donee, because charities don't have shares. The next kind of program-related investment described here is low interest loans. And this can work on both sides of the, whether you're in a qualified donee or a non-qualified donee. But again, this is when you're lending money to an organization to do something for purposes of achieving a charitable purpose. And, you know, in this category, we see social impact bonds sort of fits in this area, because your foundation may want to invest in something that's a social impact bond. It's really a contract, you're lending it. You're giving the money to the organization to spend on a particular activity, and you understand under the bond documents that you'll be repaid if the organization achieves the results. So if it's a job skills training program, if they train enough people, then the government might agree to pay you back. And in this case, there's very little interest paid. There's often a rate of return, because often let's say if you put in $1 million, the government, or let's say you put in $900,000, there may be a deal on the agreement that at the end of the day, if all of the outcomes are met, you get back 950 or $1 million, and that would be the rate of return, but there's no guarantees. And so again, if this is to a qualified donee, you know, it's relatively easy. If it's to a non-qualified donee, the agreement has to set out, you know, what are the obligations of the organization? What do they have to do? What are you looking for? And what happens if they don't do it? And that would be sort of your exercise mechanism, or your exit mechanism. The next slide, please. And so we then look at, this is the last example, the rental arrangements. So again, I mean, this is leasing property, and this is property that your charity may have. So this may not come as often with a foundation, but sometimes we have examples of foundations who want to rent out property that they may have, and they've ended up leasing it out not to a charity, but to someone who can provide activities or education that will achieve a charitable purpose. Let's say it's teaching, you know, English as a second language, or to new Canadians, and provided that the organization is going to achieve that charitable objective, the lease payments can be less than market, and you know, that would be a PRI, and the agreement would provide that the tenant would prove that they were doing the work that the charity wanted, and then would require them to go back to a market rent if they stop doing that. Now, before we go on to the next slide, I wanted to highlight that in all of these instances, well, actually more of the low interest loans in the rental arrangement, I want to highlight that there is the ability to claim expenses for DQ purposes on an annual basis, where in the example of the low interest loan, the interest rate is below what would be the market value rate, which is determined by CRA's prescribed interest rate. So if the CRA rate of interest is 3% and you're only being paid 0.5%, the value, but the difference of interest between the 0.5 and the 3 on the loan could be claimed as an expenditure where it is a PRI for purposes of this in calculating your DQ. And similarly in the lease arrangement, where there's a difference between market and what you're charging. The actual investments across the board, if you lose them, if all of this is in place, but then at the end of the day, you don't get fully paid back under any of these arrangements, there is the ability also to claim the loss as an expense for disbursement quota purposes. So because we've said for PRIs, these are assets now being used in your charitable activity, there is the ability down, you know, subsequently, not when you first invest, but if you don't get it back, to treat it as a charitable expenditure. So that's sort of the PRI examples. The next slide just is a tied to, or a link to, the Community Economic Development Guidance at CRA, which is where CRA has put a lot of this information. It's not restricted to community economic development activities. So we've often suggested to CRA there should be a separate guidance, and I think eventually we'll get it. But right now that's where you find it. So I don't know, Lise, if we want to, I don't know if there's any other questions before I jump forward
Yeah, I actually have a question, Susan, and I know that you and Troy both work with foundations quite a lot, and I'm quite interested in finding out whether foundations have been contacting you in light of COVID-19 and their concerns and questions around program-related investments. Have you had any, questions and concerns being expressed to you by any foundation clients?
Well, I have had a couple of clients say, is there something we can do in this area? So, we want to do things for COVID-19. We want to help. We have our granting for the year sort of sorted as far as what we've been doing, and we would like to find ways to support, whether it's hospitals, whether it's community organizations. And I think in that context, PRIs are coming up because there's a desire to do something, but not necessarily to give a lot of money away in some instances. So it's just, but it is early days because everybody's trying to do more and more and more for COVID-19 and finding different ways. So have I seen one that's happened? I think, another area where we see a lot of PRIs is with the Indigenous communities, because a number of those organizations are not qualified donees. So we have to find ways to invest. That's an area where someone asked me, what's happening? We want to make sure that the communities are being supported, that they have the right facilities, that et cetera. Am I aware of things that they could invest in? And at this point, it's happening so quickly that everybody's talking about it. Is there one thing I know about? No. And Troy, I'm sure you've had similar or had.
Just one very quick comment. Some of the questions I had is around, the investment is so volatile. Shares and values have dropped so aggressively. Some organizations are saying, how do we balance a very conservative, protective strategy to make sure we respect our obligations, our donor commitments, our, commitment to the endowment fund and our future in commitments that those revenues are going to rely upon, versus being able to get some more flexibility. And that's where you're seeing a lot of, I think, questions and concerns. And I think that's where the balance and the uniqueness of the situation is in, and also the fact that program-related investments are really about delivering the services in this format that there may be certain restrictions when it's just to a pure grant. So I think that that's where that balance comes in, and I think that because there's such uncertain times, I think that a lot of organizations want a sort of a comfort. And my view is always, watch your policy, watch your plan. Again, sit down, think it through, take note as to what you're doing and why you're doing it. But that's some of the questions that I'm getting a lot, is how to deal with this in this context with such fluctuation of portfolios.
Now, for the participants on the call, would you have, for somebody that's grappling with this issue here and now, and you say, you need to think it through, are there tools or resources that you could recommend to foundations that want to look at this a little bit more closely, that are concerned and want to think it through, so to speak?
Well, there's a number. I mean, there are mission investing and PRI documents, I think, on your website. There's other examples on some of the other umbrella group websites. There's the community economic development guidance. I don't think there's a lot more than that on the CRA website. There are a number of impact investing firms who have resources that people can use and that have been put together so they're available on the internet. I think the big thing is looking at some of the possible opportunities out there and really applying these kinds of rules to consider, is it going to come out of our assets as a mission investment or a prudent investment? Are we able to do something that's in the impact investing space where we would consider it more of an expenditure? Troy, are you thinking of anything else? I mean, there's...
No, I think the same thing. I mean, it's A lot of it is, like you said, is going to be really the organization looking at its own policies and procedures and restrictions and limitations. That's going to be key in order to fit this in the paradigm of a PRE or a mission-related investment. I think they've got to look at the purposes, their charitable purposes. PREs are often going to be related to, can you do it? Is it within your charitable mission? Not only is it charitable, but that goes to making sure that you understand your operating obligations and the framework that your specific organization is in.
Yeah, and I noticed that one of the participants just noticed I think that's the Investment Readiness Program website, and that is the federal government has put out funding to various organizations to help nonprofits and charities become investment ready, and the Investment Readiness Program is actually intended to create knowledge and expertise, not only in those investing, but in those who need investments on how we can make this work. So it's a great government program that is working to that, and there is actually excellent information on that. Thank you for reminding me of that, because I've looked at it a number of times, and that actually is also another great resource. Some of the Center for Impact Investing has great resources. There's a couple of organizations in Quebec that also do mission and investing that would have great resources. So there are definitely resources out there, and I'm sure if we're thinking, going forward, we could probably provide further information. But the IRP is definitely a great way to look at it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion, Susan. I think what we might want to consider, I could work with you and Troy, and we could put together a list of resources that we could then post on the PFC website with all these resources that you've suggested. So we have all that in one place, and that our members and the participants on today's webinar can go and access for more information.
Right. Okay. Well, and I think that's a great thing to do, because there have been a number of guidebooks done over the years, but they all have a lot of good information, and they all bring it forward as we move forward. So there were a few more slides. I don't know, Lise, if you want to do another question. The final slides, and I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes. I don't necessarily need to go through each one of them. But this is something that's happened in Ontario that we really want all the other provinces to get on board with. But Troy talked a lot about the prudent investor test and the rules that have to apply. And often what happens when foundations who have very good investment committees, but they're traditional investment committees, they think about the trustee rules and the investment rules from a prudent investment perspective. And they look at a PRI, and sometimes they'll say they don't understand that they can take it out of the investment side and put it in the charity side, but they sometimes say that's not a prudent, there's not enough prudence to this in this investment. There's too much risk, and we are concerned about making that investment, particularly when it's in a non-charity, where they're worried that they have to get direction and control over it, and it may just expose the charity to CRA questioning, have they invested in a way that is offside the rules. And in Ontario, what we've done, has happened successfully, and this came about because some great impact investing promoters were in the Ontario government at the time. They changed the Charities Accounting Act to actually permit a charity to make a social investment. And a social investment is defined as an investment that furthers the purposes of the charity directly. So there has to be a tie, and achieves a financial return. But the definition of financial return is a penny. A definition of financial return is that the charity gets back something more than they would get if they had made a grant. So that any amount returned is helpful. So you could fast forward to the next slide, Lise. And so what this means is that if your investment committee is saying, you've got a PRI, you really want to promote the PRI side of your foundation's activity, and you're in Ontario, but you've got directors who are worried about the trustee rules and the prudent investment rules, and they worry about that because there's potential for liability on the part of the directors for investing imprudently. It's not highly likely, but there is always that potential. That the rules in Ontario actually say if it's a social investment, then you can in fact make it without worrying about the prudent investor test. So it's actually very helpful to sort of moving forward with the impact investing space. And you know, it's part of something that I think was done in response to a concern that we hear from many foundations, public or private, that they, especially people working to do more impact investing, that they can bring it forward, but there's always a concern about the prudence of the investment and whether there's liability for directors under the trustee type rules. So this clarifies that in Ontario. It does require you to meet certain questions. Directors do have to think about it. They have to make sure it directly furthers the purpose. And Lise, if you want to go forward, it does talk about, you know, the board getting satisfied that the investment is appropriate for the charity and that it works for the charity. But I think in the context of a PRI, we could do that. So the takeaways for today are really that, you know, grants are grants. We love that, but PRIs are another option. We think that PRIs today, especially as, you know, people have seen their endowments drop in value a bit, and there's still a desire to use some of the funds, even though we may not want to just give them away, particularly where we have restrictions on capital and income, that PRIs may be a way to access dollars and support the community beyond just the traditional granting, and they allow you to look to investments in non-charities where grants can't be made. And I think, Troy, do you have any final comments you'd like to make? You're on mute, I think.
I can't. Sorry, but that my cursor was. I'm not sure. We have so few minutes left.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can get to the questions, maybe.
Yeah. Are there any more questions?
Do you have any in your chat box? I don't have any.
Well, the only comment I would say is that a PRI, it's an investment, so it's not necessarily a pure investment for the investment strategy, and you're putting certain money at risk. But because it's program related and it really fits within that paradigm, I think that it's got a less dangerous place to be in terms of risk for the overall application of the prudent investor rule. And I think that that's an important thing. And it's not a panacea. It's not, you can just put everything into PRI. You have to think about it carefully and make sure it fits. As Susan was saying, you know, that there's a certain level of prudence that the board has to take. But the thing to take with a PRI is that while it has some hallmarks of an investment, it's not fully an investment. It really relates to the program. So there's certain more flexibility in terms of the return that could be expected and how it would fit within the prudent investor standard.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you, Susan. I don't think we have any further questions. What I will do, though, I think it would be a good idea to make some resources available for foundations that want to think about this a little bit more and think it through with their foundation staff or board members. So we'll definitely do that. So thank you, Troy and Susan, for this presentation. Second week in a row. We really appreciate your time on this.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity.
I know it's a time consuming, but I think it's going to be a very useful tool for our members and for others, because we will make it accessible to all on our website. As mentioned at the beginning, we'll be sending the recording and the copy of the PowerPoint presentation to all, and you will be receiving an evaluation link. We ask that you evaluate each of our webinars so that we can improve from one time to the next and make sure that we're meeting your needs. And our theme next week on Webinar Wednesday is working remotely and cybersecurity. So a completely different topic, but I hope you will join us. And merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Merci à Troy. Merci Susan. And à la prochaine tout le monde. Thank you.
Merci. Au revoir.
Bye. Au revoir.
revoir.